The Cursed Regiment. Russia, winter, 1812. Napoleon withdrew from Moscow with his defeated army. The landscape was an endless ocean of snow and ice. But it wasn't just the cold that struck the men down. In the shadows of the forests, in the villages they plundered, and in the whispering voices carried on the wind, something far worse than death lurked. Something that was not of this world. The regiment of Lieutenants Gavrilov was a rear guard that operated near the city of Smolensk. Their task was to pursue the French and keep them away from the Russian villages. But something was different that winter. The men spoke in whispers about the dead Frenchmen they found in abandoned villages. Their faces were contorted, not with pain, but with grotesque smiles. "Looks like they saw something that gave them pleasure," muttered one of the soldiers. Gavrilov rebuked him sharply, but even he couldn't shake off the eerie feeling these corpses gave off. One night, as they sought shelter in an abandoned manor house, the men began to hear strange things. Footsteps in the snow, even though no one was outside. There was a quiet knocking on the windows, even though they were all locked. Gavrilov himself swore he heard a whisper coming from the darkness of the house. He couldn't make out the words, but they felt like an order. The next morning, a soldier had disappeared. They later found him deep in the forest, leaning against a tree, his body grotesquely twisted. His face had frozen into an unnatural smile, his lips drawn wide apart as if he had seen something horrible in his last moment. He had scratched words into the frozen ground with a stick. "They're coming." The men became increasingly restless. Gavrilov tried to calm them down with strict discipline, but soon more and more of them fell into strange trances. They talked of hearing voices calling out from the darkness of the forest. Some claimed to have seen shadows, silhouettes that looked like deceased loved ones beckoning to them. Then the dreams began. Every night, Gavrilov saw a clearing in the forest, surrounded by dead, barren trees, their branches reaching into the sky like claws. In the middle of the clearing stood an ancient tree with strange, dark bark that looked like screaming faces. Shadowy figures moved around the tree, their movements jerky, their eyes glowing red. Every night, more of his men appeared in these dreams, their faces rigid with fear before the shadows pulled them into the tree. After days of hardship, they reached an abandoned village deep in the forest. The huts had fallen into disrepair, and the snow had covered the landscape like a blanket. But in the middle of the village stood the tree from Gavrilov's dreams. It was huge, its roots spread out over the entire village square, and the bark was covered with countless faces. Some looked like distorted grimaces, others like crying children. "We shouldn't stay here," said the regiment's priest, an old man with a deep faith. But the men were already possessed. One by one they went to the tree, their faces blank and expressionless. Some put their hands on the bark as if they could feel something. Others whispered unintelligible words. Suddenly, they began to laugh, an eerie, cold laughter that shattered the silence of the forest. Gavrilov shouted for his men, trying to hold them back, but it was as if the tree was calling them. One by one, they lay down at the roots of the tree, as if they wanted to sleep. But the roots began to move, wrapping themselves around their bodies, pulling them into the frozen ground. The priest prayed aloud, but suddenly he too fell silent. His eyes glazed over, and he walked slowly towards the tree. Gavrilov was the last one still in his right mind. He drew his pistol and fired at the roots, but the bullets ricocheted as if the tree were alive. "Stay back," he shouted, but the shadows in the darkness of the forest answered him. "You can't escape us. Come to us. There is no pain here, no cold, only peace." Suddenly he felt something cold wrapping itself around his legs. He looked down and saw roots wrapped around him. The faces in the bark seemed to be laughing, their eyes following his every move. Gavrilov screamed, but the tree swallowed him up, and the clearing fell silent again. The next morning, another unit found the village. It was empty. There was no sign of Gavrilov and his men, but the clearing was strangely warm, and the snow had melted, as if something was pulsing beneath it. New faces could be seen on the bark of the tree, the faces of the men. One soldier swore he heard a voice, a soft whisper coming from the wind. "We're waiting." They moved on, but the image of the tree remained in their minds. Some later said that they dreamed of it at night, of faces moving, of roots reaching out to them, and of laughter they would never forget. Years later, the village was rediscovered by woodcutters. They wanted to cut down the tree, but none of them dared to drive an axe into the bark. Some say they heard a whisper that stopped them. Others say they saw their own faces in the tree. Since then, the village has been a deserted place, and the few who were there have returned changed, with an unnatural smile that they could not explain.